Did you know that slam poetry got its start right here in the 1980s? It's a genre that sparked competitions all over the country. We are also home to the largest youth poetry festival in the world, and we've got several institutions and community groups dedicated to this craft. So let's turn to our panel of Chicago poets. Joining us in the studio is Avery R. Young, the inaugural Chicago Poet Laureate. Good to see you again, Avery.
Good to see you, Sasha.
That big smile, as always. Also here in studio, Miss Angela Jackson, the current Illinois Poet Laureate. Welcome. Good to see you. And rounding out our panel is Regina Harris Baiocchi. 20 years ago, she founded Haiku Festival, which provides a space for kids aged 8 through 14 to share their work. Good to have you on the program, Regina.
Thank you, Sasha. Good to be here.
Let's start with you, Avery. What do you think characterizes Chicago's poetry scene? What makes us unique?
What makes Chicago unique? One is it is a metropolis. So there is I believe, a concentration on the poems are not necessarily about hills and trees. The poems tend to be about buildings and people, humans moving around in this complicated metropolis. Yes, so I
more
think
realistic, more authentic?
No, I don't necessarily think a poem about a tree isn't as authentic. I mean, people write about what's outside of their window for the most part.
Yeah.
They write about what they write, either what's outside of their window or what's in the room that they're sitting in. And in Chicago, you see skyscrapers as opposed to seeing mountains.
Yeah.
You see when Jamila writes about LSD, she's talking about the Lakeshore Drive, and that's very unique.
Yes.
To a city like Chicago, as opposed to if I was in Des Moines, Iowa, and I would be writing about Lakeshore Drive. So
that is correct. There's a rich poetic history here,
yes.
Avery. What stands out to you?
Oh, my gosh. When you talk about the rich history of Chicago, the first person I think about is Gwendolyn Brooks, who is like the mother. The mother of poetry. But you think about the people who also have close ties to Chicago, the Langston Hughes. You have to think about the poetry slam that created by Mark Smith over at the at the Green Mill. You think about Louder Than a Bomb, which I had a opportunity to be sitting with the teaching artists along with Anna and Kevin, and we all kind of said, this is what we want to do. And then it blossomed to the largest youth poetry festival in the whole world. Right. And I think, and for them, they have a very unique, those youth that came out of that or come out of that particular poetry festival, they have a unique experience with poetry that I didn't have. I didn't at 14 or 15, I did not have this huge festival to go to have poetry, and I think
that's incredible.
That makes Nate and Jamila and Eve a very unique pocket of people because they've had this poetry with them since they've been 13, 14 years
absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Which is a big deal.
It's a big deal.
Well, we've touched on Miss Gwendolyn Brooks.
Yes.
So, Miss Jackson, I know that you are following in her footsteps as an Illinois Poet Laureate. You wrote a book about her as well. What do you think is her legacy in Chicago? Gwendolyn Brooks.
Her legacy is a supremely rich legacy. Miss Brooks was known for her excellence in the use of language. She could do anything with language. She made language new. Another feature of her work was her accurate and loving depiction of her community, the entire African American community. I should say Black, because she preferred the term Black because it was all encompassing, global in its use and meaning. She also was a poet of love.
Yeah.
You could tell that her spirit was a loving and generous one, and she passed that along to the people who would call her their mentor.
Yeah. I want to hear some more poetry about Chicago. So I'm going to turn to you, Regina. You've got a haiku that you can share with us?
Oh, sure. I have a haiku. I'm going to read it twice.
Sure.
Revealing the moon on Lake Michigan's shoreline, eyes bury themselves. Revealing the moon on Lake Michigan's shoreline, eyes bury themselves. And that's a haiku that I wrote recently. I am addicted to Twitter. Don't call it X yet, but anyway. And I post poems throughout the day, and I follow the writing community. And Chicago is one of my favorite subjects to write about. I'm so glad that Avery mentioned Langston Hughes, because Gwendolyn Brooks, Langston Hughes, and Richard Wright all wrote for the Chicago Defender. So at one time, all three of those powerhouse people were writing poetry for the Chicago Defender. Richard Wright wrote the preface for Gwendolyn Brooks' first poetry book. So we have all of these, richness, and out of that, growing up to where we are today. So Chicago, a lot of people think of it as a second city, but they don't realize it's a second city because we rebuilt on what the Chicago fire left behind. And what a great legacy we have, not just, imagine being in a city where, you have someone who an entire apartment complex is named after him.
Yes.
The Big Shoulders poet. And what did he do? Like any great poet, named Gwendolyn Brooks as his successor. So I think it speaks a lot about the poetry community, that, we care about each other. Yeah. And I know that Angela, has been a great mentor to me as well as Miss Brooks. But going back to Carl Sandburg, saying, I want Gwendolyn Brooks to succeed me, that's DEI long before DEI was coined the term.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So I think that speaks volumes about Chicago and how close-knit we are as a community. And I'm so proud of my kids. I hope, and I call them my kids, but, this year we got poems from over 1,300 kids.
Oh, wow.
In the past 20 years, we've read 37,000 poems were sent by kids.
Well, you know what? Here's a good time to listen to some haikus by Chicago youth.
Perfect.
My name is Adonis Abraham, and this is my haiku. Winter's breath whispers, frost-kissed morning hush the earth, silent cold prevails.
My name is Mandel Shamsi, and I am 13 years old. This is my haiku. Lonely moon-drunk thing, trapped in the grasp of the light, howl your bitter cry.
Hi, my name is Aoki Robinson, and I did a haiku on butterflies. Butterflies, ballet, fluttering wings paint the sky, nature's graceful dance.
Oh, talk more about the importance of creating spaces for youth to participate in poetry.
We all have the same roots. When I was 7 years old, my mom took me to the Museum of Science and Industry, and Gwendolyn Brooks, who was the Poet Laureate of Illinois, had a poetry festival, and I was one of the kids who went to read. And when I finished reading, she opened her pocketbook and gave us money. So, hey, I'm turned on. I was already turned on to poetry, but someone's going to open their pocketbook and hand me cash. And long story short, when I got home, my mom said, sit down and write Miss Brooks a thank you note. And I said, of course. I wrote her a thank you note, and I'm 7 years old, and I sent her, this is a poem that I read in case you forgot who I was. She did a dangerous thing. She wrote me back. We became pen pals. And even though she lived on 78th and Evans and I lived on 41st and Wabash, we wrote each other religiously.
Oh, what a story.
She gave me such great feedback. And so in December 2000, when she passed, I was talking to Hakeem Adabuti, her cultural son, and Nora Brooks Blakely, her biological daughter. And I said, is anyone going to, take up where she left off with the youth? And, everyone's busy. And long story short, Haiku Festival was born.
Yeah.
And so I mean, just even to compare myself with her, it's not a comparison. She just inspired me to do it. That's how Haiku Festival was born.
You know, I think, Avery, for a lot of us, we're introduced to poetry in school, right?
Yes.
I remember fourth grade having to be part of my classmates writing a poetry anthology.
Yes.
This was in Toronto. Our English teacher, made us memorize things like Robert Frost or Edgar Allan Poe. What was the role of poetry in your childhood, Avery? I want to hear from you and from Miss Jackson on this one.
Oh, it was a great role, a leading role. I grew up in Chicago, West Side Chicago, but I also grew up Baptist. And poetry is all the way is Sunday service all day long, from the hymns to the sermon to the, whatever the choir is singing. And I was always in the oratory contest, and I remember trying to read, but he was cool. I was lucky, and the teacher was like, "You can't read that because of some of the language." And then it went to Claude McKay's "If We Must Die," and teacher almost by the time I finished performing that poem, teacher, we should have went with where he was cool.
They weren't ready for that.
People are afraid after he read after I recited "If We Must Die," but pivotal point in my life.
Yeah.
8 years old, third grade. My first poem is in response to a teacher saying something that I thought was just really crazy to say to an 8-year-old child. And I thought I was reading the teacher for filth because that was my point. I was going to, over the weekend, I was going to write this poem and I was going to read it to her on Monday and let her know what I was feeling. And she was
Cursing
like,
her out with a poem.
she was like, "Avery, that's beautiful." I'm like, "What?" "It's beautiful. I ain't want to be beautiful. I want you to cry." But what I learned in that moment was, because, I've always had like this mouth. The mouth will go mouth kind of crazy. But that mouth in the context of a poem, people would listen. And not only did people listen, they admired and they loved it, and I was like, okay. And then it wasn't just about mouthing off.
Yeah.
It was really about me having an avenue to kind of describe the world that I'm living in. So the role of poetry, and then what it means to me, and then also like now as an inaugural poet laureate
It's stayed with you. It's incredible.
It's a great role.
So, Miss Jackson, same question, and your advice then, right? You've got the ears of young people. What's your advice to young poets?
My advice to young poets is listen and read. Try to read as much poetry as you can. But even more than that, listen, because there is poetry in everyday language, and you just happen to be open to it. My father spoke in metaphors. There was poetry in the blues.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There was poetry in the gospel songs.
Yeah.
So if you can't get a hold to poetry books, just listen to what's around you, and you will hear poetry, and it will fine-tune you to the world of poetry.
Regina, poetry's been evolving, right, throughout your career, throughout your lifetime. What excites you about this current moment?
What excites me about this current moment is just knowing that so many kids are writing. And, I'm not necessarily a huge hip-hop fan, but one thing I love about hip-hop is that it started every young person to walk around with a spiral notebook and a pen and a pencil. And a lot of people, I write on my phone sometimes, but people still carry that pen and paper. Still, young kids still carry it. This is an anthology that we're publishing this year, 20th anniversary haiku anthology. And this is proof positive that kids are writing, that they're thinking. Some of the things, there's a poem in here from a student from Ghana, because when we experienced the global shutdown, a lot of kids from all over the world sent in poetry.
Right.
And just the idea that someone is living through a war-torn city, and here's a poem from Samira Hussein. She is a 14-year-old in Accra, Ghana. The bombed old city. In a creative art class, one child repaints it. 14 years old. I mean,
Wow.
my goodness, 14 years old. And to be in Accra and say, I want to send this poem to Chicago. Just being able to reach out to someone thousands of miles away, that's the beauty of poetry. I mean, music
Yeah.
has the same feeling, art has the same, but poetry is something that's coming from these young children. They don't necessarily need to have any special training just to be able to write down their feelings.
Everyone at this table smiled when you read that poem. Last words to you, Avery. Just leave us with advice for those behind you.
Fall in love with poetry. Because poetry can be your best friend. It definitely is. It definitely will be why people will stop and listen to you. Right,
Yeah.
so.
We'll leave it there. We've been talking with Avery R. Young, Angela Jackson, and Regina Harris Baiocchi. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you,
Thank
Sasha.
you, Sasha.
Thank you.